Sometimes the most peaceful places conceal the darkest secrets. Springboro, Ohio, was one of those postcard-perfect towns. Neat lawns, friendly neighbors, doors left unlocked. People trusted each other here, and crimes belonged to stories from faraway cities, not this quiet corner of America. It was the kind of place where you waved to your mailman every morning, and children rode their bikes until sunset without fear. But behind the calm surface, something unthinkable was about to happen. One ordinary morning would shatter that fragile peace forever. What began as a seemingly random tragedy would unravel into a story of deception, ambition, and a chilling twist that no one could have predicted. The case would not only expose the darkness lurking beneath the surface of a family's happiness, but would also raise questions about trust, love, and the lengths a man might go to protect or destroy his own life. This is the story of Vicki Barton, a woman full of kindness, expecting her first child, and her husband, Jim Barton, a respected police officer whose dream was to become the chief of Springboro's police department. Together, they seemed to have everything: love, success, and the future within reach. Until one day, that illusion of safety vanished, and their perfect world was replaced by a nightmare that would haunt the town for decades. Jim and Vicki Barton were the kind of couple everyone admired. They met when they were young in the small town of Middletown, Ohio. Horses brought them together, a shared passion that quickly became the symbol of their love. Vicki was known for her gentle nature and endless energy. She could spend hours at the local stables, brushing her favorite mare, whispering to the animal as if it were a friend. Jim often joined her after his shifts, his uniform still smelling of rain and dust, and together they dreamed of a quiet life surrounded by the peace of the countryside. In 1980, they married. A few years later, they moved to Springboro, a smaller, quieter town where everyone seemed to know everyone. It was there that they built their little paradise, a modest home with white fences and a small stable in the back. It wasn't much, but to them, it was everything. They had worked hard, saved carefully, and finally achieved what they had always wanted: a home built not from luxury, but from love. Jim had joined the local police department. His dedication and discipline quickly earned him respect. After 15 years of service, he had become a lieutenant, and everyone knew he was next in line to be chief. Vicki, on the other hand, had found her calling at the town hospital. She wasn't a doctor, but her compassion made her indispensable. Patients said she had a way of bringing calm even to those who were facing their final days. By 1995, their lives seemed perfect. Vicki had just been promoted to senior nurse. Jim was closer than ever to achieving his dream. And then came the news that filled their home with even greater joy. Vicki was pregnant. After 15 years of marriage, they were finally going to become parents. Their friends said the couple glowed with happiness. Nobody could have guessed that this same year, their lives would be torn apart by something so cruel that even time would fail to heal it. April 11th, 1995, began like any other spring morning in Springboro. The air smelled of rain, and the sun cast a soft golden hue over the Barton property. Jim kissed his wife before leaving for work, resting his hand gently on her stomach. "I love you," he told her, smiling. Vicki laughed, reminding him not to overwork himself at the station. She had the day off and planned to spend it tending to the horses and resting. Later that morning, while Jim was at the police department, the phone rang. It was Vicki. She sounded calm, but mentioned something strange. A young man had come to the house asking for gasoline. He said his car had run out just down the road. Out of kindness, she had lent him a small container of fuel. Jim frowned. "You shouldn't have opened the door," he told her, half joking, half worried. Vicki reassured him that everything was fine. The man seemed polite, harmless even. That was the last time Jim heard his wife's voice. Hours later, when his shift ended, Jim drove home as usual. But as he pulled into the driveway, something felt wrong. The front door was wide open. The afternoon light fell across the threshold, revealing a silence that felt unnatural. Calling her name, he stepped inside, and the world he knew collapsed. What he found inside was beyond comprehension. Vicki was lying on the kitchen floor, motionless. The room was in disarray, the warmth of their home replaced by a chilling emptiness. She wasn't breathing. Everything around him blurred. The sound of his heartbeat, the ringing in his ears, the disbelief that the woman he had loved for 15 years, the mother of his unborn child, was gone. With trembling hands, Jim called the situation. His voice broke as he spoke. "I think my wife's been killed. Please, send help." When police units arrived at the Barton residence, even the most experienced officers were stunned. Springboro was not the kind of town where terrible things happened. Murders were unheard of, and this was no ordinary case. The victim was the wife of one of their own. The investigation began immediately, every corner of the house examined, every detail recorded. At first glance, it looked like a robbery gone wrong. Around $1,000 in cash was missing from a drawer. But something didn't add up. Expensive jewelry had been left behind, and Jim's collection of firearms, though clearly handled, remained untouched. The killer had taken only the cash, nothing else. It was as if they wanted the scene to look like a burglary, but not actually profit from it. Forensics scoured the scene. There were no foreign fingerprints, no footprints, no forced entry. Whoever had entered the house had left almost no trace, except one. On the victim's body, investigators found biological evidence that could be analyzed. It was the only clue they had, a silent witness that might speak through science. The DNA sample was carefully tested, but it didn't match anyone in the national database. The police then compared it with the profiles of everyone close to the Bartons: family, friends, co-workers, even Jim himself. No match. The lieutenant's alibi was solid. He had been at work the entire day, with multiple officers confirming his presence. Weeks turned into months, and still no answers. The case that had once been top priority slowly grew cold. For a long time, the town lived in fear, locking their doors for the first time in years. People whispered that it must have been a drifter, someone passing through. But those who knew Springboro best couldn't shake the feeling that this story was far from over, that something about it still didn't make sense. And they were right, because 4 years later, a simple arrest in a nearby town would blow this case wide open again. 4 years after Vicki's death, the case had faded into silence, until one day, a routine police operation in a nearby town called Richeville brought an unexpected twist. Officers arrested a man named Gary Hansen for burglary and drug possession, a small-time criminal, nothing unusual. But during questioning, Hansen made a statement that froze the detectives in place. He claimed to know something about the murder of a police officer's wife. There was only one such case in the area, the Barton case. At first, the detectives didn't believe him. Informants often tried to bargain for lighter sentences with made-up stories. But Hansen said something no one outside the investigation could possibly know, that the victim had bite marks on her chest. That detail had never been released to the public. When asked how he knew, Hansen explained that his half-brother, William Phelps, had confessed it to him years earlier. According to Hansen, Phelps and an unknown accomplice had planned a burglary in Springboro back in 1995. They chose the Bartons' home because it looked wealthy. A nice car, an isolated property, no close neighbors. They had no idea it belonged to a police officer. Phelps told Hansen that he had gone to the door pretending to need gasoline, the same story Vicki had told her husband that morning. When she confirmed she was home alone, Phelps returned later with his partner. The plan was only to steal money, but something went terribly wrong. Hansen said Phelps described his accomplice as unstable, aggressive, under the influence of something that made him lose control. When the woman resisted, the man turned violent. Phelps panicked, grabbed what he could, about $1,000 in cash, and fled the scene. Then he heard 3 gunshots. 3 months later, William Phelps took his own life. Neighbors said he had been paranoid, afraid of shadows, and constantly checking the locks on his doors. He couldn't sleep. He told friends that someone would come for him. When detectives compared Phelps's DNA to the sample from the Barton house, it didn't match, nor did Hansen's, which meant only one thing. The mysterious second man, the true killer, was still out there. But the real shock was yet to come, because years later, investigators would realize that one crucial clue had been sitting in front of them the whole time, in Jim Barton's own voice. 8 years had passed since that April morning. A new team of detectives was assigned to review the Barton file, a cold case that had never truly stopped haunting the town. As they combed through the evidence, one small detail caught their attention: the original recording of Jim Barton's 911 call. At first, the call sounded like any desperate plea for help. Jim's voice trembled with panic as he described what he had found: But in the middle of the call, there was a phrase that investigators had somehow overlooked for years. Jim said something that sounded like, "I've got to call Phelps." The name made their blood run cold. Phelps, the same man connected to Gary Hansen's confession. But how could Jim Barton have known that name back in 1995, when police themselves hadn't even heard it yet? When confronted, Jim denied ever saying the name. He insisted he had said, "I've got to call for help." The difference was just one word, but it changed everything. To settle the debate, detectives brought in a forensic linguist, Dr. Robert Fox, an expert in acoustic analysis. Using advanced audio software, he compared the sounds of Phelps and help in Jim's voice patterns. The results were undeniable. Jim had indeed said Phelps. That revelation turned the investigation upside down. How could Jim have known the name of a man supposedly involved in his wife's death, unless he had some kind of connection to him? The new detectives began to suspect that maybe the lieutenant wasn't as innocent as everyone had believed. They re-examined the rest of the recording. At one point, faint noises could be heard in the background, the sound of Jim moving objects around. For any police officer, that was an unforgivable mistake. Everyone in law enforcement knows never to touch or alter a crime scene. So, why would a seasoned officer do it, unless he was trying to hide something? Soon after, a woman came forward. She had worked as a waitress in a small diner in Richville, the same town where Phelps used to live. She told police she had seen Jim Barton there, sitting at a booth with William Phelps, only days before Vicki's death. She remembered it clearly because Jim had left her an unusually generous tip. The final question remained, why? Why would Jim Barton, a respected officer, a husband expecting his first child, ever arrange something that led to his wife's death? The answer, when it came, was almost too absurd to believe. When detectives finally pieced it all together, the picture that emerged was tragic and almost unbelievable. According to new evidence and witness statements, Jim Barton hadn't planned his wife's death. What he had wanted was something far more reckless. And yet, it would destroy everything he loved. Jim had been just one step away from becoming the chief of police in Springboro. But there was a problem. The Bartons' house, the home they had built together with so much care, was technically outside the city limits. According to state law, the police chief had to live within the city. It was a small technicality, but one that stood between Jim and his lifelong dream. He had begged Vicki to move, but she loved their quiet life in the countryside. The stables, the horses, the morning light spilling through the kitchen window. She wanted their child to grow up there, far from the noise of town. To her, that house was happiness. To him, it was an obstacle. So, desperate and foolish, Jim hired William Phelps to stage a break-in. The plan was never meant to harm anyone, just to frighten Vicki enough that she would finally agree to move. Jim left exactly $1,000 in cash in the house, payment for the job, disguised as stolen money. But plans built on lies always crumble. Phelps brought an accomplice who was high, unstable, and violent. Within minutes, the fake burglary turned into a horror Jim could never undo. When he came home and found Vicki's body, he was shattered, but also terrified. The scene was far worse than what he had arranged. In shock, he called 911, and in that moment of panic, he let the name Phelps slip. It was an accident that would haunt him for the rest of his life. 10 years later, in 2005, Jim Barton was arrested and charged with complicity in his wife's death. The evidence against him was circumstantial. A few phrases, a waitress's memory, a desperate mistake on the phone. But together, they painted a damning portrait. In court, he maintained his innocence, saying he had never met Phelps, that the call was misunderstood. Yet the jury believed otherwise. He was sentenced to 50 years in prison. For the town of Springboro, it was the final betrayal. A trusted officer exposed as the architect of the tragedy that had haunted them for a decade. But the story didn't end there, because 11 years later, something unexpected happened. A legal twist that would set Jim Barton free. Jim Barton spent more than a decade behind bars, maintaining the same quiet claim. "I never meant for anyone to die." Those words became the echo of a man trapped between guilt and denial. To many, he was a manipulator, a man who had orchestrated terror for ambition. To others, he was a broken husband, crushed under the weight of an accident that spiraled beyond his control. After 11 years in prison, Barton's lawyers appealed for a new trial. arguing that the evidence against him had always been circumstantial. While preparing for that retrial, Jim was offered an unusual deal, an Alford plea. Under this legal agreement, he could plead guilty without admitting guilt. In essence, he would acknowledge that the prosecution had enough evidence to convict him while still maintaining his innocence. It was a strange balance between confession and defiance, between truth and survival. Jim accepted. He had already served the equivalent of the sentence offered under the plea, 11 years. The court released him immediately. He walked out of the prison gates at 61 years old, carrying nothing but the silence of a man who had lost everything: his wife, his career, and his honor. When reporters tried to question him, Jim said nothing. He simply looked down and walked past, his new wife, once Vicki's closest friend, standing quietly beside him. The town that once adored him no longer knew what to believe. Was he a victim of bad judgment or the mastermind of his own tragedy? Springboro never found closure. The mysterious accomplice of William Phelps was never identified. The unanswered questions still hung in the air, like dust in an old photograph. How much did Jim really know? Was Vicki's death the result of chance, or the punishment of a man who tried to manipulate fate? In the end, the story of Jim and Vicki Barton became a quiet warning whispered across small towns. That ambition, even dressed in good intentions, can become the seed of ruin. The town returned to its quiet rhythm. Doors were locked now, trust came slower, and somewhere in the wind that swept through the fields near the Barton home, you could almost hear a voice saying, "Some tragedies don't end. They just grow silent."